Mkosakwe Indigenous. I'm Margaret Pearce, and I'll be joining you for the Wednesday session of the workshop. In that session, we'll explore Indigenous and Colonial mapping in New England land records. These are the 17th and 18th century records documenting the buying and selling of Indigenous land, including land deeds, testimonies, petitions, and other types of documents. It'll be a hands-on activity on how to work with those records to learn how dispossession happens. So to prepare, this video is a background introduction to that world. As you know from reading William Cronin, the dispossession of Indigenous territories in southern New England didn't happen by treaty, as in some parts of North America, but by land sales, the sale and purchase of native land by groups of town proprietors or by individuals. As part of that sale, the land had to be described and mapped, which means there are thousands of records where Indigenous people and English people, or Indigenous and Dutch people, mapped places together. This was the mechanism of dispossession in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and parts of New York and northern New England. If we read these land records closely, if we try to understand what they say and how they fit together, we can learn a lot about how colonization and dispossession happens on the ground, how mapping was central to that process, and how the effects can be seen in the structure of the landscape around us. So to illustrate that, I'm going to take you through what that process looked like and then walk you through two examples. Then on Wednesday, when we actually meet, I'll give you your own puzzle to solve with the maps and documents. If we look at Thomas Kitchen's 1758 map of Connecticut, we can see clearly how town boundaries developed west of the Connecticut River as large areas that were only later subdivided into smaller towns. Here's the Connecticut River here, and here notice that the size of these towns are really large. These are the original sizes in Connecticut Colony. In my research, I focused on the region associated with the second wave of English colonization during the mid-17th century. And I chose this region because it's a good snapshot of what land transactions looked like when they had settled into a general protocol between Native and English people. So settlements started on the Connecticut River and along the coast, and I focused on this first wave inland in here when there was this protocol established between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people for land transactions. Also, this was a region where there hadn't been, at that time, much scholarship on those land records. These town boundaries were drawn over the ancient traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. As you know, people known by the names of the central village with which they are associated: Massaco, Tunxis, Wiantanok, Pagusset, and Potatuck peoples. So how did mapping play into dispossession in this region? Well, before we can answer that, we need to look at this word map and what mapping was during this time in history. One of the primary ways that Indigenous people mapped their land here was with place names. And I love this sign because if we go to the left, we can be in this world of indigeneity. If we go right, we can be in this world of early Puritan settlers. It's our choice. This always makes me laugh. Indigenous place names map by describing the places they name, how a place looks or smells, or what it sounds like, or how the place is used. And Cronin writes about this in that Bounding the Land chapter that you read. Names also map through a secondary level of implied meanings, which may define territorial boundaries, mark the availability of plants or animals, explain a travel route, or tell part of a story or a lesson. These multi-leveled place names are then organized, memorized, and given physical manifestation on the land through a network of marked rocks, marked trees, paths, and riverways, all of which serve as a mnemonic web for learning, remembering, and navigating the landscape. So, for example, here's a place name from near where I live on Penobscot territory in Maine. The name is Wasquan. The literal translation is their liver, which tells you that the place has the shape and color of liver when you're paddling by it in a canoe. This is an island. Wasquan also has an implied meaning that comes from its presence in one story about Gluskabe, the transformer hero for Penobscot people, where Gluskabe kills a moose calf and throws the calf's liver into the bay. So the implied meaning is this is the calf's liver, that island. And there's at least one reason to memorize that story, because Wasquan is also an island that gives you a sight line to an inland water route. So if you know the story, you know that if you go to the calf's liver, you can find that inland route. So here's a visual translation of that story in a corner of the map I collaborated on with James Francis and Carol Dana at Penobscot Nation. And if you look at the left map, that's the Penobscot side, Penobscot language side of the map. And if you look at the swatch on the right, those are the English translations. So coming down from the north, Gluskabe jumps and lands at a place called at the Old Jagged Snowshoe. That's the translation of the place name. Kills the calf here where it is narrow, then threw the entrails to his dog, who had swum over to at the island between two bodies of water. This place name also is entrails. And where he threw the liver is the color of liver. Here's this island, Wasquan, and here it is here, and you can see that it gives this sight line to this really important inland route, which is otherwise hard to see and protects us from the danger of going straight up the bay. The place names, stories, and canoe routes around Wasquan are traditionally reinforced with a web of other place markers, including Wickegan, the inscribed birch bark, bent trees, and other objects. So it's this geography of place names and story, completed by marked objects and the travelers, that together constitute the map. That kind of map doesn't resemble what's conventionally called a map in the non-Indigenous world today, but at that time it was perfect for Indigenous people in need of highly portable and memorizable maps to navigate and represent their territories, and it remains perfect today. So let's compare that mapping tradition to the traditions brought by colonists. In England at that time, during the 1600s, a new mode of property mapping was emerging, one which used techniques to produce graphic maps that were both measurable and visually decorative. These maps were made with new tools. These were the cutting-edge tools of the day, such as the circumferentor or surveyor's compass for direction and the chain for measuring distance, and using new techniques explained in survey manuals such as these. But the people who colonized Western Connecticut didn't have these tools, nor the training to make these kinds of maps. Even the chain which we assume, or scholars often assume, was not present until later, much later in the towns. Surveys such as this one for the town of Lebanon wouldn't be made in Connecticut until the late 1700s. Until that time, for the first 5 generations, colonists drew on an older medieval tradition of written surveys, which they then adapted to meet their new circumstances. This is an image from a 1537 survey treatise called the Book of Measuring of Land. In that earlier tradition, land was mapped by perambulating the boundaries of a manor and inspecting tenants' fields and holdings. So this perambulation, walking the perimeter, and observing the details. Tenants would then testify in court about which lands they were occupying and using. That information was then compiled in court rolls or terriers. There was no interior measurement of the land, nor any overall final graphic, even when the surveyors included sketches in their notes. Instead, the word, both written and oral, and the resulting written survey were considered the more accurate documentation for recording property. It was from this tradition that Connecticut colonists set out to map land holdings in their new landscape. They continued to use the traditions of oral testimony and agreement between buyers and sellers, the marking of trees and property corners, and the write-up of the entire transaction in the town records. So again, here we have a map tradition very different from what Anglo-American society might think of as a map today. These two traditions, Indigenous and English, collided in the mapping of land sales. Over time, across the generations, a protocol emerged that combined the mapping traditions of both Native and English people, and the protocol went like this. The first step, as you know from reading Cronin, when colonists came looking for indigenous land to settle as their own, a group of men known as the town proprietors would meet with a group of indigenous people to make a verbal agreement. The proprietors likely saw this transaction as the first step in land transfer, even if the agreement was actually about permission to use the land in a specific way, like grazing, planting, mining, or building a house or mill, and not about outright possession. The verbal agreement was followed by a more formalized viewing of the land by the proprietors when they would make a visual survey of the land and write a report for the colony. And deed negotiations also began when colonial proprietors and indigenous people met to negotiate and record the terms and price of the land sale with the assistance of interpreters, witnesses, and the town clerk. But a key factor to remember is that in Connecticut, until the 1700s, Native people did not read or write English. That means that for the first century of land sales, everything that is written in these land records was written by a colonist, and everything that was read to Native people about the details of those agreements was read to them by colonists. There's a 1681 letter from John Talcott that vividly describes the mayhem of the deed negotiations from his perspective. Gentlemen, I confess my many errors by reason of the after blots. The truth is, I was shortened for time, and having but one day after the court to write in and draw the model of the deed before the Indians were appointed to be at my house, and then there came a considerable company of them, that I could not do anything in reference to the drawing it over more fair, being willing to gain as many hands and seals as I could then, otherwise it would have been more decently prepared and presented to your view. And at that time of drawing, many people crowding in upon me put me beyond my ordinary pace, and the Indian names, being many and odd, were hard, difficult to retain, and distinctly and precisely to enter. And hath often been in my thoughts to have reviewed it, but have feared that I should not get the Indians together to sign. They live in such a scattered way, and a great distance from one another, that in another year in reason would have been little enough to have brought this matter to pass, and thought perhaps some might die whose names were in as something, I don't know the word there, as business to adventure upon that which has proved so troublesome already. So, troublesome, difficult, crowded, and rushed for time. If the negotiation was successful, a royal patent was issued, and in that patent the town would be remapped and renamed. There would then be an official declaration of the boundaries by witnessing and marking the corner trees or stones, often by native and English people together. This tradition of corner marking has been attributed to English influence, but it's important to remember that native people had their own tradition at that time of marking trees and heaping stones as a way to define territories and spatial stories. If there was a dispute about the terms or outcomes of the sale, it was legal for both English and Indigenous people to file a claim in the colonial court. And that's native land sales mapping in a nutshell. So notice that Indigenous people were part of this process at specific stages with varying degrees of power. And here I've highlighted those stages in yellow to show where Native people were involved. And those that are in white, those are places where there was the separate mapping activity happening. This was, even though I've listed them sequentially, they didn't happen sequentially necessarily. Colonists frequently adapted the process in a way which would best serve their interests, especially when Native people were unwilling to sell. Patents were sometimes issued before an Indigenous land sale was obtained, or if, for example, it wasn't actually a sale, if it was a use. Or proprietors negotiated with Native people having no rights to the land in question. And yet each stage combines mapping practices that come from both Indigenous and English traditions, word-based maps, marking trees and rocks, and testimony. So let's look at two examples. The first one is for land on the Naugatuck River, which runs down through here in western Connecticut from reaches in northwestern Connecticut, but then the main river from Torrington. You can just follow this highway line down here into Waterbury and down to just south of Ansonia here, where the mouth empties into the Housatonic River before flowing into the Sound there. The land record we're going to look at comes from this area in here, just south of Waterbury. We Indians of Milford, having sold a certain tract of land lying in a place called Niamps, bounded northerly with Beacon Hill River, easterly with Milford, westerly with Naugatuck River, south with Lebanon River. And the date is April 1, 1709. So first of all, we know that this land sale is for land on the east side of the Naugatuck because the Naugatuck is the west bounds. But the first way that the land is mapped before the rest is through an Indigenous place name, Niamps. And if we look in Trumbull's 1881 in Indian place names in Connecticut, he tells us that Niamps means point of rock. And then the land is remapped by a perimeter boundary. And this is a relatively late deed, 1709, so there's plenty of English renaming already present. Beacon Hill, Milford, and Lebanon. If we look at the old USGS Geological Survey topographical map for this area, and this is at a scale of 1 to 63,360, we find a Beacon Hill Brook right here on the north side of Beacon Hill. So Beacon Hill Brook, that is the north bounds of this parcel. And we already know that we're on the east side of the river, so we know we're in this space here somewhere. Nothing on this map is named Lebanon River, but if we do a search of Lebanon River online, the Beacon Falls Historical Society tells us it's the old name for the lower portion of Hockanum Brook, which is this brook here. So here's this lower portion down in here. So now we know the south bounds. Now we have this. The name Milford as the eastern bounds doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense because Milford is at the mouth of the Housatonic. But in 1709, when the towns were still large areas of land, as you saw previously in that kitchen map, Milford town boundaries extended north to what later became the town of Bethany. And here you can see this ANY, this is the name town of Bethany coming up here. So now we know where this deed refers to. That gives us the full perimeter, which is the English version of what is being sold. But the Pagusset map of the sale was the place called Nyamps. There's no place name on this map that sounds like Nyamps. If we look at the contours, however, it does make sense that there would be a place here known by a meaning close to Point of Rock. So you can see how steep it is here along the river in contrast to the areas directly north and south of it. And it's steep on the west side as well, but this has a uniquely steep section. And then there's this place here called High Rock Grove, which suggests a place called High Rock, which again seems related to this Point of Rock translation for Nyamps. Now, does it help to look at a larger scale USGS topo map? This one is 1 to 24,000 scale. And in this case, no, it's just the same information. Beacon Hill Brook, Naugatuck River, here's High Rock Grove, and here's Hockanum Brook down here, then known as Lebanon River. But that name Nyamps does appear nearby in a different anglicized form, near the confluence of the Hockanum and what used to be the Lebanon River, which is not near High Rock Grove. It's, if we look back, this place we're looking at right now on the Google map is down here. High Rock Grove is up there. There is a street here that someone has named Nyamp Place. So here the indigenous name has been repositioned and anglicized rather than referring to a particular site, and is now used in this English tradition of memorializing something from the past rather than describing a place in the present. So again, that example is short because it comes from the 1700s, which is somewhat late during this land sale dispossession time, and it concerns a relatively small area that hasn't yet been part of any land sale. Kind of like they're filling in the holes of what they want to buy or what they are coercively buying. For the second example, let's compare that to an earlier deed, and this is for land directly north of the Nyamps sale. This one is from 1684 and is typical of land transactions at that time, dense with indigenous place names as the primary mapping language, and that being those place names providing this detailed fabric for the land sale. So Wikibemius orients us, then we have all these named indigenous place names, and then that's reorienting, saying where those places are. And then we go to the west side of the river and we see all of these other indigenous place names being sold, and then that is oriented again. And then it finishes with a perimeter. So there's plenty here that we can interpret and understand just by using our map skills, not knowing how to speak the language or even knowing much about the people who were buying and selling. In this first section, they're telling us Wikibeamius is land upon Beacon Hill Brook, which we already know where that is from the Nyamps land sale. We also already know this name Lebanon from the previous deed. So straight northward of Lebanon and Beacon Hill Brook, called, notice they say, called by the English Beacon Hill Brook. And the Mattituck bounds is was the original name for what later became the town of Waterbury. So we know we're in the vicinity of Waterbury. So to get oriented, I just stuck two of the older 1 to 62,000, 1 to 63,000 topos together. Here is the Nyamps parcel down here. So the area we're looking at now, here's Waterbury and here's Beacon Hill Brook. So we know we're on two sides of the river somewhere in this space. So then we have 9 named parcel places which the deed tells us are south of what's now called Waterbury and east of the Naugatuck River. And then the next sentence, we learn that these 9 places include all of the land between Beacon Hill Brook and another brook called Squonk, which is a new word. And then there's this place called Judd's Meadows here, which is familiar if you know that two of the Mattituck proprietors, their last name was Judd. And if we look at Bronson's 1858 History of Waterbury, he tells us that Judd's Meadows were the lowlands between Beacon Hill Brook and the area of Hop Brook and Fulling Mill Brook. So if we look back at the old topo again, here is Beacon Hill Brook, and there's nothing on this map called Squonk, and there's nothing called Judd's Meadows. But Bronson told us to look for Hop Brook and Fulling Mill Brook. So we do find Hop Brook, and it is up here, coming down, emptying into the Naugatuck here. But confusingly, as you see, it's on the west side of the river, not the east. So this section deals with the east side of the river, but it's using a feature called Judd's Meadows, which we now know is on both sides of the river. We know it's at least on the west side of the river, excuse me. But there's nothing here called Fulling Mill Brook, which is the other piece of Judd's Meadows. But what if we check the 1972 USGS topo? And I mentioned that date, 1972, specifically because during the 1960s and the 70s, the USGS was really diligent about mapping place names and recording many of the local vernacular place names. And since that time, it's pretty much been downhill for the presence of place names on USGS topos. They just don't include them the way they used to. So if you want to learn those early names, I urge you to delve into the old USGS editions, especially from the 60s and 70s, which are all available on TopoView. And next time someone says to you that a 1970s printed paper map is obsolete, you can set them straight about all that they include. Anyway, when we check the 1972 topo, we do find that brook. So let's look. Here is Hop Brook coming down in here into the town now called Naugatuck, and almost directly across is this Fulling Mill Brook over here on the east side. So Judd's Meadows, we know, is this whole space in here. So we know that that is part of that land transaction. Okay, then the last phrase states that the land extends all the way to Wallingford and New Haven town lines. So we know that those 9 parcels are all somewhere in here on the east side. there. So then we learn there are 11 places named on the west side of the river, south of the line between Quassapog Pond and the river. Okay, which puts us in, here's Quassapog Pond on the west side, and the 11 places named are south of the line between Quassapog Pond and the river, so they are somewhere up in here. Which makes sense because Hop Brook is way up in here too. And both Quassapog Pond and Tewantic, I didn't point out Tewantic. If we go back, there's this place named Tewantic, and on this old topo there is a hill here called Tewantic Hill. So this line, this is a line to the river from Tewantic, a pond there actually, going to the river. And then the final section of the deed wraps up by giving us a description of the perimeter. A straight line to be run to the middle of Tewantic Pond or the Cedar Swamp. The south line, which is the west, bounds towards Woodbury. East line from Tewantic Pond. And then it gives a couple more place names, which we don't know where those are, but we have an idea in terms of the perimeter. And these parcels lying within the township of Mattituck, and so on. So if we go back to our historic topo images, if we were to follow this carefully on the map, we would find that we were in this space right here on both sides. Okay, now the issue I haven't directly addressed yet is dispossession itself. As you know from reading Cronin, Indigenous and English ideas of land rights were and are very different. Cronin describes Indigenous land rights as based on what he calls usufruct rights, that is, the right to use a particular land area rather than outright possession. Although that today, I would say that's understood more in terms of the right to take care of the land. Whereas for colonists, land rights were based on fee simple ownership. But both colonists and Indigenous people had understandings of territorial borders. And with time and experience, both sides came to understand the meaning of the land sale in these transactions. So given that, where and how are Indigenous lands being taken against their will? A careful reading of the deeds reveals the strategies colonists used to obtain more land than was being sold. These strategies are at every stage of the mapping and remapping of land sales and town boundaries, because in fact, each of these stages is a moment of cartographic vulnerability. A map is being translated from one form to another, and anything can go wrong with that translation, especially when not all of the people involved are present. Remember that not all of these stages involve Indigenous people. So, for example, one technique was to manipulate the meanings of the Indigenous place names to make them refer to larger areas. Native place names are site-specific to particular geographical features, such as a river confluence or a meadow, as we've already seen, and rarely refer to large areas of land or water because it's just not specific enough. Colonists, on the other hand, wanted large tracts of 5 or 10 miles square on which to build their towns. So to achieve the land transaction they wanted, proprietors stretched those native place names to encompass land that was actually a web of many names. Once the native place name was anglicized to an area instead of a site, it could be efficiently replaced with an English place name in the royal patent because it was already effectively an English name. So, for example, to pick up the thread from the deed we looked at, Mattituck, the place, became Mattituck, the space, became Waterbury, the space. Massico, the place, became Massico, became Simsbury. Pawgusset became Pawgusset, became Derby, and so on. And in fact, the first example I gave you, I didn't put that on this map, but if you think about Nyumphs was a point of rock, but Nyumphs, as it was redefined in the deed, became this whole large space, not just the rock itself. So one of these place names is the indigenous meaning, and one is this anglicized meaning, when they're not the same. That process wiped out the whole indigenous map by burying and silencing the native names beneath the single anglicized native name, which is stretched to include land outside of the actual meaning. Colonists then further maximized the size of their land purchases by defining that land area with an axis, two perpendicular lines of uncertain limitation on the landscape. Remapping by axis was often used in the patent, but sometimes it appeared in the native land deed itself in a separate section from the native mapping of the territory. And the fact that it's in a separate section makes me think it was never read aloud to the non-English speakers. So this is where I disagree with Cronin. He cites these axis maps as evidence that maps are moving from the vague territory, his words, vague, territory of descriptive bounds, like brooks and meadows, to the increasingly precise measurement of geometric surveys. But in my research, it leads me to the opposite conclusion. It's the descriptive surveys that are more precise because they refer to specific parcels of land, whereas the axis surveys are the ones that are more vague, even though they contain numbers. A claim based on an axis has no perimeter, with infinite potential for stretching into additional regions of native territory. It also has no definition on the ground. If you remember, for the first 100 years, these guys are verbal map makers, not land surveyors, so they really don't have ability to accurately measure mileage and mark it on the ground. And then other techniques for encroaching on land include marking trees for beyond the borders of the agreed upon boundaries. And then people also forged native land deeds when they were unable to obtain a lawful deed of sale. So these were two other places where there were opportunities to dispossess. So that gives you an overview of the land transactions process, a feel for what the deeds sound like, how they were used as a tool of dispossession, and some strategies for finding those deeds on topo maps. So on Wednesday, we'll start an activity together where you'll get to try your hand at some map and deed interpretation of your own. It's a great puzzle, and I'm looking forward to meeting you then. Timigwech.